On a cold February day in 1957, a strange cardboard box lay half-buried in the weeds near Susquehanna Road in the Fox Chase neighborhood of Philadelphia. It looked like nothing at first, just trash dumped in the woods. But what lay inside would spark one of America's most haunting mysteries. Wrapped in a thin, cheap flannel blanket was the body of a young boy, naked, bruised, and abandoned. His eyes were closed, his features soft, frozen in time. He looked to be about 4 to 6 years old. No one knew who he was. No one ever reported him missing. First, no one even knew he was there. A gruesome find no one was supposed to see. The boy's body wasn't found by police. It was discovered by accident twice. First, by a college student who was out checking his animal traps. He didn't want to get involved and said nothing. Days later, a young man on a walk through the area spotted the box. When he looked inside, he ran to the police. The box itself had originally held a bassinet, stamped with the name J.C. Penney. The cardboard was damp from rain, and the boy's body was partially decomposed. But what shocked investigators the most wasn't just how he died. It was the total lack of identity. A mystery child with no name. He had no clothes. His small fingernails had been carefully trimmed. His hair had been recently and roughly cut. Bits of it still clung to his body, suggesting someone had tried to disguise his appearance. There were bruises and injuries that hinted at long-term abuse. His emaciated frame told investigators that he had likely suffered long before his death. Who was this child? Why had no one come looking for him? The police released a post-mortem photo, retouched to make him look peaceful, almost sleeping, hoping anyone, might recognize the boy. No one did. A city shaken by a nameless child. The image was plastered everywhere in Philadelphia. Store windows, police stations, utility poles. Volunteers sent out 400,000 flyers. The city's morgue kept the boy's body in cold storage while authorities begged for answers. The headlines were heartbreaking. Who is the boy in the box? The saddest case Philadelphia has ever seen. Will no one claim this child? What haunted the city wasn't just the murder. It was the silence. The total lack of identity. A murdered child with no name, no family, no past. Theories start to form and fall apart. Was he an orphan? A runaway? A kidnapped child? Investigators checked hospital birth records. They visited every orphanage, foster home, and school in the tri-state area. No match. Dental records? Nothing. Fingerprints? No hits. Missing person reports? None that matched. For every possible lead, there was a dead end. And with every passing day, the case grew colder. What was left behind? The only real clues were small and chilling. The box, traced to a local store that sold dozens of identical bassinets. The blanket, a faded, mass-produced type, no unique markings. The haircut, possibly done in haste. The child's condition, malnourished, battered, and discarded like garbage. But perhaps the most disturbing clue was what wasn't there. No identity, no missing child alert, no one stepping forward. This wasn't just a murder. This was erasure. A cold case begins. As the winter deepened, the trail went cold. The child was buried in a small potter's field with a tombstone that read simply, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." But to Philadelphia, and eventually the nation, he became known as the boy in the box. What followed would be decades of obsession, false leads, relentless detective work, and finally, the breakthroughs of modern science. But in 1957, all anyone had was a nameless boy, a box, and a brutal silence. By the time March 1957 rolled in, Philadelphia was a city under a spell, the kind only the unexplained can cast. The brutal discovery of a small, battered boy's body, discarded in a box and wrapped in a blanket, had already unsettled residents. But the longer the child remained unidentified, the stronger the public obsession grew. He wasn't just a body anymore. He was a symbol of everything wrong with a world where a child could be murdered and forgotten. Police exhaust every option. The Philadelphia Police Department knew this case was different. Homicide detectives worked around the clock. Flyers bearing the boy's face, retouched postmortem, were mailed to every police station, post office, and school in Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Over 400,000 flyers were distributed. They were inserted into utility bills, hung in store windows, pinned on trees and phone poles, even sent with gas company invoices. If you were alive and living in the Philadelphia area, you knew his face. Still, no one recognized him. The media joins the hunt. The local press jumped on the case. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran front-page stories almost daily. Radio stations repeated the details, urging the public to come forward. National outlets picked it up. The boy's photo, a haunting black and white image of a child who looked asleep, began to appear in newspapers from coast to coast. Journalists dubbed him America's unknown child. There were calls for help from the FBI, public appeals by police, but no leads emerged that explained who he was or why no one had come forward to claim him. The silence was deafening. Hundreds of leads, none with answers. As the tips poured in, police followed every trail. One man claimed the boy had been his neighbor's son. False. A woman said she saw a family move suspiciously overnight near the discovery site. No connection. A traveling circus was investigated in case he had been a child performer. Dead end. Orphanages, foster homes, hospitals, and schools were contacted across multiple states. Nothing. For every possible answer, there were more questions. Theories began to take shape. Public theories began to take hold, some logical, others outlandish. The secret child theory. The boy was an illegitimate child hidden by a family, then murdered to keep the secret. The foster home theory. He had been in the care of unlicensed foster parents who abused him, then dumped his body. The black market adoption theory. Perhaps he'd been passed between homes under the radar and abused without authorities ever knowing he existed. Each theory brought hope and frustration. The mystery man who wouldn't let go. One of the most enduring figures in this case was Remington Bristow, a medical examiner's office employee. Bristow wasn't just curious, he became obsessed. He used his own money to investigate. He visited psychic mediums. He posed as a customer to investigate suspicious foster homes. He carried the boy's image in his wallet for the rest of his life. He even arranged a second burial for the child decades later, with a proper headstone that read, America's unknown child. The emotional toll. Detectives began suffering emotionally. Some took the case home with them, unable to sleep. They had kids of their own. How could a child vanish from the world with no one noticing? The public grew paranoid. Everyone wondered, what if he lived nearby? What if his killer was still walking among them? How many more children were out there, forgotten, invisible? Mothers locked their doors tighter. Neighbors eyed each other suspiciously. For months, Philadelphia didn't feel safe. Hope begins to fade. As spring turned to summer, and no solid answers surfaced, media coverage began to fade. Other stories pushed the boy in the box off the front page. But detectives never closed the case. He remained in the files, case number 57 to 2440, and remained etched into the city's consciousness. It was a tragedy with no name, no closure, and no one to mourn him, except for the strangers who refused to forget. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. As the years dragged on, the case of the boy in the box remained open, but painfully cold. New generations of detectives inherited it. Fresh eyes brought fresh energy. But time wasn't kind to evidence. Memories faded, witnesses died, and leads evaporated. Yet the case refused to die. It clung to the walls of the Philadelphia Police Department like a ghost no one could exorcise. And then, in the 1990s, decades after the boy had been buried, a strange woman walked into the picture. A chilling confession that went nowhere. Long before M emerged, law enforcement had already chased dozens of so-called confessions. One man claimed he'd killed the boy during a robbery gone wrong. Another confessed on his deathbed in Texas. A third inmate insisted the child had been trafficked and disposed of in Philadelphia as part of a larger crime ring. But every story broke down under pressure. Details didn't match. Timelines failed. Forensic testing ruled them out. The desperation for answers led police to entertain even the most bizarre claims, only to hit brick wall after brick wall. The arrival of A Whispered Truth? In 2002, an Ohio psychiatrist contacted Philadelphia authorities. One of her patients, who asked to be referred to only as M, claimed she knew exactly what happened to the boy in the box. What she described was horrifying. According to M, her mother had purchased a young boy in the 1950s, essentially buying him on the black market. She claimed he had been abused for years and, one night, after vomiting baked beans and wetting the bed, the mother snapped and killed him in a fit of rage. M said she remembered watching her mother give the boy a violent bath and later seeing the child wrapped in a blanket. Then, she said, they drove to Philadelphia and dumped his body in a cardboard box. Details that matched. Investigators were stunned. For the first time, someone was offering information that hadn't been made public. The baked beans in the child's stomach during the autopsy. That detail had never been released. The condition of the blanket, coarse, patterned, and old, matched her description. M correctly described the layout of the wooded area where the boy was found. Even the part about the bath seemed eerily plausible. The child's body had been freshly cleaned, with clumps of wet hair still stuck to his body. Was this the break they'd been waiting for? The problem with M's story. Despite the promising details, cracks began to form. M had a history of severe mental illness. Her memories were fuzzy, fragmented, and possibly contaminated by decades of media coverage. Her family, when questioned, denied everything. There were no records of any adopted or foster children. No neighbors ever remembered seeing another child in the house. And without a name, date of birth, or identity for the murdered boy she described, investigators were stuck. There was no way to confirm her story. They couldn't even determine where the supposed transaction had taken place. Still, the lead haunted detectives. If she was lying, she was a master. If she was telling the truth, the killer had died decades earlier, and justice had once again slipped through their fingers. The DNA roadblock. Around the same time M came forward, science had begun catching up to the case. The boy's body had been exhumed in 1998 to retrieve DNA from his teeth. Investigators hoped that technology, which had advanced rapidly since the 1950s, could finally put a name to the child. But there was a problem. The sample wasn't viable enough for a complete DNA profile. It would take several more years and several more scientific breakthroughs before genetic genealogy could be considered an option. Back then, the best they had was hope, and a haunting, unconfirmed story from a troubled woman with nothing to gain. The public reacts. News of M's account reignited public interest. Was this it? Could the decades-old mystery finally be solved? Talk shows discussed the case. True crime books revisited it. Online forums buzzed with theories. But just as quickly as it returned to the spotlight, the story faded again. Without hard proof, M's tale was shelved alongside all the others. Another maybe in a case full of almosts. An unforgiving silence. By the end of the 2000s, the boy's small grave at Ivy Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia had become a place of pilgrimage. Locals visited often, leaving teddy bears and flowers. His headstone still read, "America's unknown child." Who was he? Why had no one come forward? How could a young boy vanish without a trace? Without love, without protection, without anyone? These were the questions that drove a city to obsession and law enforcement to the brink. And still, no one had the answer. For over 6 decades, the boy in the box remained a haunting enigma. His face plastered on billboards, his story echoed in countless articles, and yet his name remained unknown. But what decades of detective work couldn't solve, DNA technology would begin to unravel. By the early 2010s, the age of genetic genealogy was here, and with it came a sliver of hope in one of America's oldest mysteries. The exhumation that sparked new hope. In 2019, for the third time, authorities exhumed the boy's remains from Ivy Hill Cemetery. This time, they weren't after partial DNA or degraded samples. They had a new mission: extract mitochondrial and autosomal DNA that could be uploaded to genealogy databases. It was a long shot, The remains were over 60 years old, and time had not been kind to the child buried in a wooden coffin. But the forensic team working on the case had access to new tools, machines that could work with minute traces of genetic material, reconstructing fragments into a usable profile. And finally, they got a hit. Enter genetic genealogy. The breakthrough came not through a criminal database, but from public genealogy websites, platforms like GeneMatch and Family Tree DNA. These tools, famously used to catch the Golden State Killer, allowed forensic experts to search for distant relatives of the unidentified boy. The process was meticulous. Investigators traced potential relatives, mapped family trees, and reached out to individuals who had submitted their DNA for ancestry research, never expecting to be linked to a 1957 murder case. Bit by bit, the puzzle came together. The moment the boy got his name back. In November 2022, the decades-old mystery cracked wide open. Philadelphia police made the stunning announcement. The boy in the box has been identified. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Born in January 1953, Joseph was just 4 years old when his life was cut short and his body discarded like trash in a cardboard box. For so long, he had been a nameless symbol of loss. Now, he was a child with a family, a birthday, and a name etched in history. The revelation brought shockwaves through the true crime community and through Philadelphia, which had mourned him without knowing him. Who was Joseph Augustus Zarelli? Joseph was born to a young, unmarried couple in Philadelphia. Records showed that his parents were teenagers at the time, and Joseph was placed in a complicated, possibly unstable family situation. Details about his life remained guarded for legal and privacy reasons, but what became clear was this: someone close to him likely knew what happened. Investigators now believe that Joseph may have lived in neglect, and that someone in his circle may have hidden his death. But despite naming him, no one was arrested. Yet, the big question still loomed. Who killed Joseph and why? The family's silence. After the identification was made, living relatives were contacted. Some were reportedly cooperative. Others remained tight-lipped, either out of fear, shame, or simply because they had no knowledge of the events. Joseph had half-siblings who may never have even known he existed. The police kept details sparse, stating only that the case was still an active homicide investigation. They wanted to give Joseph dignity, but they also wanted justice. And the world wanted to know, how did no one report this child missing? Media frenzy and renewed public interest. News outlets across the country ran headlines. Boy in the box identified after 65 years. Joseph Zarelli. The cold case that DNA finally solved. From number to name, America's unknown child is unknown no more. True crime YouTube channels exploded with new content. Online sleuths dug into the Zarelli family tree. Forums lit up with speculation. Viewers who had never heard of the case were now obsessed. But amidst all the noise, one truth stood out. Joseph's story mattered. He was no longer a case file. He was no longer forgotten. And though the road to justice was still long, his voice had finally been heard through science. The grave revisited. At Ivy Hill Cemetery, Joseph's grave was updated. The headstone that once read America's Unknown Child was now joined by a new marker, one with his real name. Visitors left flowers. Reporters gathered. Locals stood silently, holding candles for a boy who had spent too long alone. Detectives who had worked the case for decades broke down in tears. One of them said, "This is the moment we always hoped would come, but weren't sure it ever would. Now he has a name. Now we fight for justice." An ending, or just the beginning? Identifying Joseph Augustus Zarelli was a massive breakthrough, but it was only the beginning of a new chapter. Now, the focus turned to the killer, who in Joseph's life had failed him, who had covered up his death for more than half a century. And would science help find not just the boy's identity, but his killers? The identification of Joseph Augustus Zarelli marked one of the most remarkable moments in American cold case history. After nearly 66 years, the nameless child who had haunted detectives, journalists, and everyday citizens finally had an identity. But as one mystery was solved, another immediately took its place. Who killed Joseph? And why has no one ever come forward? This chapter isn't just about what we now know. It's about what we still don't, and the battle to turn closure into justice. A case reopened, not closed. With Joseph's name confirmed in December 2022, Philadelphia police made it clear, this case is far from over. In fact, the investigation entered a new phase. Detectives could now trace Joseph's family tree, explore custodial records, and dig into the circumstances of his early life. The biggest lead wasn't physical evidence, but people. Those who were alive in 1957, who knew the Zarelli family, and who may have held secrets for decades. But there was a challenge. Many potential witnesses were either dead or elderly. Some had changed names, moved states, or built lives far removed from their past. Still, investigators pressed forward, quietly building a timeline, reviewing old case files, and cross-checking DNA results with public records. They believed someone, perhaps still alive, knew what happened. Why wasn't he ever reported missing? One of the most chilling questions about this case remained. Why didn't anyone report Joseph missing? The answer may lie in his early family dynamics. Joseph was born out of wedlock, at a time when that was socially taboo. Some reports suggest that his birth was never officially recorded, or that efforts were made to conceal his existence. There are theories that he may have been placed in an unofficial foster home. He was possibly passed between relatives in secret. He may have lived with people who had no legal guardianship over him. If that's true, then Joseph wasn't just a forgotten child, he was an invisible one. Who could the killer be? Speculation swirled following the identification. Could the killer be a biological parent, a step-parent or guardian, a caretaker in an unlicensed foster arrangement, someone in the neighborhood who saw something and stayed silent? Detectives haven't named any suspects publicly, but behind the scenes they've been pursuing leads, especially with the Zarelli family tree now accessible. There are whispers of people who refuse to talk, and of sealed juvenile records that might contain hidden truths. At this point, solving the case would likely require either a confession, a credible witness breaking their silence, or a deathbed revelation. Justice, it seemed, was still within reach, but just barely. The ethics of naming the victim. The announcement of Joseph's identity sparked ethical debates as well. Some family members objected to the name being released publicly. They feared being associated with a crime they knew nothing about, or being targeted by the media and amateur sleuths. But law enforcement insisted that naming Joseph was both just and necessary. He wasn't just a victim, he was a human being whose identity mattered. The public had carried his case for decades. He belonged not just to a family but to history, and naming him was the first step toward holding someone accountable. The legacy of America's unknown child. Today, Joseph's story is taught in forensic science programs. His case is used in training sessions for law enforcement on how to handle cold cases, DNA-based genealogy, and media engagement. He has become a symbol of persistence in the face of decades-long silence, the power of modern science to speak for the voiceless, and the impact of communities who refuse to let a child be forgotten. His grave is now a memorial, visited by strangers who leave teddy bears, candles, and handwritten notes. It's a site of reflection, not just for what happened to Joseph, but for how far we've come in seeking justice for the nameless and abandoned. Final thoughts. Will there ever be justice? The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened to Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The killer or killers may already be gone. The secrets may have died in silence. But the effort to bring him justice isn't over. His name now sits in cold case files, not as a number, but as a child. A boy who lived, suffered, and died, but who was ultimately remembered. And maybe, just maybe, someone who has stayed quiet for too long will see his name in the headlines and finally speak up. Because justice delayed is not always justice denied. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell.